On this edition of Independent Sources, the power of New York City's ethnic vote.
People who are registered Democrat in the city but did not vote in the primary, what happens when they turn out to the polls in the general election.
And voting rights on the chopping block after major changes to the Voters' Rights Act.
Section 5 allowed us to have a real role. Now, without the Section 5 being effective, it's going to be much more difficult in future redistricting for us to play a role.
Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Gary Pierre-Pierre. 2012's presidential election highlighted how potent a political force Latinos are in this country. Since then, some politicians have been making a more concerted effort to court that community along with other ethnic minorities. Here in New York City, it was no different during the recent primaries. Many candidates actively campaigned in immigrant neighborhoods. So how real is the power of the city's ethnic and immigrant vote? I try to get some answers from journalist Javier Castaño and Stephen Romulewski, the director of CUNY's Mapping Service Center for Urban Research. Steve, you've had a chance to look at the numbers from the ethnic vote in the city, all of the votes in general, but you look analyzing the ethnic vote so far. You're not completely done, but what can you tell us so far? What are the surprises? What are the trends that you expected to happen and didn't happen, and what happened?
Well, I think a couple of interesting things. One interesting thing was that Bill de Blasio did as well as he did in central Brooklyn and southeast Queens, areas with large black populations, especially given that that Bill Thompson was in the race, who a lot of people expected to get those votes, but he didn't. His vote patterns in southeast Queens and central Brooklyn, I mean, he got votes there. It's just that Bill de Blasio got a lot more.
Okay.
And so I think that really pushed him over the top. Another interesting thing was that John Liu, his vote support was really limited to areas of Flushing and Queens, Chinatown and Manhattan, parts of southern Brooklyn that have had big Asian immigrant populations recently. And when he ran in 2009, he got stronger support in broader areas of the city, including some areas like that we just talked about, southeast Queens rather, and central Brooklyn, Harlem, but he didn't do as well in those areas this time around.
Javier, John Liu appeared to have galvanized the recent new immigrant vote. He was all over the place. Every community, John Liu was there many, many times. But he had some serious inquiry into his campaign financing practices. In the end, was it the fact that those inquiries were too much that he didn't really do well? What do you think?
Yeah, John Liu tried really hard to reach out to the Latino community, especially to the new immigrants. He went all over the place, to the Flushing and to Long Island City, and also to the city in general. But the new arrival, the new immigrants, they don't vote as a group. So probably the group that really voted for him was the Korean and Chinese people from Flushing. But the vote from the Latino community went probably to Bill de Blasio.
Well, we don't have to say probably. I mean, we have the expert here who can tell us. So how did it go?
Well, you know, the biggest population in the primary were white populations. And Javier's right, recent immigrant populations don't vote as much. And I think it'll be a really big question how the people who are registered Democrat in the city but did not vote in the primary, what happens when they turn out to the polls in the general election? Mm-hmm. Will de Blasio be able to, maintain his support in immigrant and non-white communities?
Do you know what percentage of the new immigrants didn't come out?
We don't have those numbers yet because we have to get the updated data eventually from the Board of Elections.
Now, Javier, in Queens, the Latino community, how did they do? Who was the major candidates who were the major candidates that they supported?
I have the feeling that John Liu was really there for Latinos and the population in general. De Blasio also campaigned a lot, but I guess the most established Latinos went for Christy Quinn, but it wasn't enough, I guess, for her.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The other question, Steve, when you look about new voters and sort of old white voters, what is the difference between the two, the turnout there?
Generally speaking, the percentage of people who are able to register to vote and actually register is much higher in the, I guess more traditional white communities. And that, partly because the citizenship rate is higher and has been higher. Mm-hmm. So the voter registration efforts need to be more aggressive and have been to some extent. But and that translates to people turning out to the polls as well.
This is interesting in many ways that now we're getting real-time numbers. How would candidates now look at these numbers, and what would they glean from there? Where would they go from there?
Well, I think the data really helps people understand, where really down to the block, mm-hmm. where the votes are coming from and who's turning out to vote, and what the characteristics are. So it can help the candidates tremendously in future elections.
Okay. How is the Get Out a Vote campaign going in Queens?
Problem with the Latino community in Queens and in general is that they don't see a candidate who represents them. Mm-hmm. They don't see a leader. They don't see somebody who can guide them in education, in housing. They see the same thing all over, especially from the Democratic Party. The Republican Party basically doesn't exist there. Mm-hmm. So we need to encourage more leadership, and we need to...
So is it because you're saying that there's a lack of Latino politicians, or it's just like the politicians in general, even Latino ones, are not talking about issues that are important to Latinos?
I guess in New York City there is not a single Latino who really can do the role of that leader in the Latino community. The only one right now in the race is Adolfo Carrion. He claims to be independent, but he is part of the Democratic Party, has mm-hmm. been for forever, I guess. So we need to create another kind of leadership, another kind of path for the Latino community, especially if Bill de Blasio is going to win, because he is probably the most progressive. So the Latino community has the opportunity to really fiscalize him and really push for the Latino agenda.
So let's do what we do best as journalists, try to predict what would happen in general election. Where would the ethnic vote fall?
I think the big question is, as Javier is saying, how well the candidates really appeal to the interests of the new immigrant populations, and also what happens with the people that they're registered Democrats that did not vote in the primary. What are they going to do? Are they going to follow the pattern that they have in the past, where they've voted primarily for Republican candidates or against Democratic candidates, or will they embrace the Democratic candidate, Bill de Blasio?
Javier in Queens.
I think Bill de Blasio is going to win the election and, for mayor, but Joe Loda is going to put a fight. And yesterday, regarding the Latino community and new immigrants, Bill de Blasio made the first mistake. He didn't go to the Mexican parade, okay. And Loda was there looking for the Latino vote. So that's very important.
All right. Well, Javier, thank you very much. Steve, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
When we come back, what's got some voters' rights advocates very concerned? Before that, Zafis LeBrun has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic and community media. There's a growing movement to get Muslims involved in politics. Recently, several prominent Muslims gathered at the American Muslim Council Political Action Committee dinner in central New Jersey to discuss the issue. Political activist Sam Khan of AMPAC told News India Times quote, Muslims in America feel isolated and afraid because they are looked upon as potential terrorists. From the Uptowner, it's only been a month since the city's new all-borough taxis have been on the streets, and drivers are already running into problems. Drivers say some people are reluctant to ride with them since they question whether the service is legitimate. They also complain that there have been delays in setting up meters and signs for the cars. The city set up the green taxi system to serve customers in Upper Manhattan and outer boroughs who normally have a hard time getting service from yellow cabs. An organization that has given over $50 million to Jewish scholars since the 1960s will close its doors for good in 2014. The Ford reports that the Foundation for Jewish Culture still has net assets of more than $4 million, but the organization is struggling to support its operating costs due to a decrease in funding. The foundation will work with attorneys to distribute its assets to other organizations in order to sustain its existing programs through the supervision of other nonprofits. El Diario La Prensa highlighted Latino union leaders who are continuing the fight for workers' rights despite the dwindling number of unionized workers. Hector Figueroa, president of CEU 32BJ, the largest union in the country, says unions should fill the void for leadership in the East Coast Latino community. Cindy Estrada, the first Latina vice president of United Automobile Workers, says immigration reform could help strengthen unions, as it would allow thousands of immigrant workers to come out of the shadows and push for decent jobs and wages. And finally, the 7th annual African Day Parade will be held in Harlem on September 22nd. Prominent African leaders, including former South African President Nelson Mandela and members of the African diaspora, will be honored for their accomplishments. The parade will begin at noon, going from 135th Street to 122nd Street along Malcolm X Boulevard. This will be followed by a festival at Marcus Garvey Park in East Harlem. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic and community media. There'll be more independent sources after this.
Thanks for staying tuned. Late last year, there was a lot made of the map of redistricted areas that emerged after the 2010 census. There were the usual fears of gerrymandering and new ones over diluting the ethnic vote. Now that the primaries have passed, I asked Angela Falon and Esmeralda Simmons whether those fears were realized and why they're concerned about the further erosion of voter rights. Esmeralda, last year I remember we had a lot of discussions about redistricting and how it was going to impact new voters, immigrant voters. So last week we had an elections. How things happen? How did things happen?
Well, good news is that redistricting occurred and there were new districts created to basically take in the population that is New York City, new immigrant population since 2000. But most of the immigrant new districts did not elect people from their community. One in particular that I was following and advocated for heavily was the new 46th in Brooklyn, which was to cover Caribbean immigrant population that had moved into the Canarsie area.
Who ended up winning that seat?
A former assemblyman from Bath Beach wound up winning that seat.
His opponent was a Haitian American
yes,
lady.
Exactly. She ran a great campaign. But as we predicted, my center had suggested a map along with the Latino Justice and Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And in our map, that seat was like 52%. When they finished drawing it, it was barely 50%. I'm talking about voting age population and of minority people. So, and the registration we know with new immigrants is not comparable to people who have been here before. So therefore, they lost this election. I'm not happy about it, but 4 years from now, let's see what happens. Exactly.
Angela, one of the worries and one of the fears of redistricting this time is precisely what Esmeralda mentioned about the lack of minority representation in the city council. What happened there?
Well, actually, what's interesting is the majority of the city council members are people of color, which is interesting. A lot of people may not realize that because when you look at City Hall, you know, that's not the case at City Hall in terms of the mayor's office, but the city council is that. And I think one of the things about redistricting that's important is I don't think there were any dramatic changes as a result of redistricting in terms of representation, but we were able to hold the line. And I think there were places where some changes were made that there may be a payoff in the future. There are some communities that really got shafted. I think the Asian American community really in Queens and Brooklyn.
So?
Well, they were split between different, like in Queens, there were some areas that were Asian that were split between 4 districts, for example. So they split up the vote. Same thing around Bensonhurst. In the Latino community, you know, I think we kind of held firm in terms of representation. There were some changes. The most dramatic one was East Harlem, where that district was moved. A lot of it was moved into the Bronx. So now whoever the representative there is going to have to deal with the Manhattan and the Bronx organizations in terms of politically. That's going to be an interesting situation there.
Who are the big winners?
Well, the thing is, the big winners, I think, for the most part, were incumbents, unfortunately.
Yes.
We weren't able to get the kind of competition that I think we wanted, although there was, for example, in Brooklyn, in the Sunset Park area, you had this guy, Manchaca, who's the first Mexican-American, who unseated an incumbent, Sarah Gonzalez, and I think that was successful in that regard.
That was surprising.
It's surprising.
That was surprising, yeah, exactly. Because we didn't think of the Mexican-American community as being politically active.
Well, it wasn't just the Mexican-American community. I mean, the people kind of jumped to that and say, well, it's the Mexican-American community, but there was an activist there who won, who I think also reflected the fact that the Sarah Gonzalez was really not seen as an effective leader and had a terrible attendance record in city council, and really she kind of blew it there. And I think you had this young activist, openly gay, who was able to get the resources and had the energy and it was able to turn that around. So I think that was something that I think not just the fact that there's a growing Mexican population, but I think the Latino and other communities in that area also weren't happy with the incumbent.
Sure. Let's broaden the conversation to the Voting Rights Act.
Well, the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act specifically, is the reason we were able to hold on to and create.
Explain to those of us who are not familiar with Section 5.
Okay,
Give us a little
you get
primer.
as much of it as you want.
No, not that much, a little bit.
Well, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, as it was before it was demolished, required New York City and New York State to report to the federal government any voting rights changes, including redistricting maps, before they put them into effect. The federal government would then look at them, see if they would have a discriminatory impact on blacks, Latinos, and Asians, and in other parts of the country, not Native Americans, etc. And if it did have a negative impact, it would stop them from putting that into effect. So it had a major chilling effect against discriminatory actions. Well, the new districting lines were voted on before the Supreme Court decision came down in Shelby County. After the Supreme Court decision came down in Shelby County, New York State did exactly what Texas did. They ran in, passed a legislation around voting in terms of bringing the old machines back. Because there was no Section 5, there was no pre-clearance. That's what we call the review.
Sure.
And everybody that does voting rights were talking about how those old machines were going to confuse people, because people are now used to the electronic machines, then they were going to break down. Everything we predicted happened. If the Justice Department had been in there, they would have taken a real close look at the use of those machines. My center actually went to court in 1988 to stop the use of broken machines in minority communities. And here we are again.
So what's the pushback, Angelo? You have the last word.
Well, the thing is that this was an important tool for our communities in terms of giving us some leverage. Section 5 allowed us to have a real role. Now, without the Section 5 being effective, it's going to be much more difficult in future redistricting for us to play a role. And this revolved not just the lines, but as Meralda mentioned, things like the machines, the whole process.
Poll site changes.
And all sorts of things. So now it's a whole different ballgame. Now there's a push in the Congress now by various civil rights organizations and voting rights organizations to try to get that legislation back in, because what the US Supreme Court did, they overturned the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act that had overwhelming support in the Congress. So now the idea is that there are people that are being approached. Gillibrand is part of this process, the senator. You have people like Sensenbrenner and others that are part of this process of trying to basically bring that legislation back and give that power back to communities like ours to be able to represent ourselves better.
Well, thank you very much, Angela and Esmeralda Simmons. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Still to come, Tai Chi, the healing art. Finally, from martial art to healing art, Taiji is making inroads into the integrative medicine departments of major hospitals. Taiji master Yang Yang holds a PhD in kinesiology, the study of human movement. He's been working with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to deliver supportive care and new healing therapies to their patients. Judith Escalona filed this report.
Taiji is an ancient Chinese martial art that's found a new home in some of America's leading medical establishments. Yang Yang, a Taiji master from China, has made it his mission to reintroduce the thousand-year philosophy and form to the West as a healing art.
The goal of my practice is to continue to work through class, through teaching, and the research to find the efficacy and the mechanism of this ancient practice, and also to reach out to a big population to help their daily life.
Yang should know he was a sickly child who was banned from physical activity in elementary school because of his illness. He learned Taiji to manage his condition.
I was born with congenital heart condition. Then the doctor told my family I could not live too long. And my family just said, well, because we're so close to the Chen village, so many people doing Taiji to improve your health, and how about let's start a Taiji and see what happens.
What happened was that practicing the art daily gave him a new lease on life.
The physical change started about 2 years after I started. You feel you're getting stronger and stronger, and then later I find out I could do wrestling with the big boys.
Eventually, Yang went on to college in Shanghai, where he competed against professional martial artists, winning 3 championships. His personal experience opened him up to Taiji's healing potential and spurred his desire to help others. Yang moved to the U.S. and received a Ph.D. in kinesiology from the University of Illinois in Champaign, where he began his scientific research into the health benefits of Taiji, developing what he calls evidence-based Tai Chi.
So evidence-based here means we designed the program and we look at the efficacy of this program through scientific research. One of the examples is randomized controlled trial. In this case, we look at what's the effect of this specific program on balance. And we also did a study on immune function and strength and cognition.
The test groups in Champlain showed marked improvement in all 4 areas.
The study we recruited, the age range was from 65 to 95. The average age in that group was 80.
At the Integrative Medicine Department of Memorial Sloan Kettering, one of the preeminent cancer hospitals in the U.S., Dr. Gary Deng sees the role of Taiji and other healing methods as complementing Western medical practices.
We take a holistic approach to people's health and incorporate some of the unconventional therapies to help cancer patients improve their life. We look at patients as a whole. rather than a disease process. There is a lot of focus on the interaction between body, mind, and spirit, and how we can strengthen both the body, the mind, and the spiritual needs of the patients.
Deng says there's still much research to be done to prove Taiji's effectiveness in healing and enhancing a patient's quality of life. Taiji Master Yang, he believes, has the necessary experience and skills to bring this work to fruition.
He is a very accomplished Tai Chi master. His practice and his way of teaching is very effective. On the other hand, he also had experience in doing research, clinical studies, and in this modality.
So far, Yang has seen marked improvements in cancer patients and the elderly. He says the healthy and young can also benefit from practicing Tai Chi. I'm Judith Escalona, Independent Sources.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. We leave you tonight with a few New Yorkers' thoughts on the upcoming mayoral election.
I think I'm going to vote for Bill de Blasio. I like his vision for the city. I like the fact that he cares about working families. And I just think he represents what modern New Yorkers are like.
I like a lot of Bill Thompson's because he was basically running before. I know he does a lot with the community. Bill de Blasio's also a front runner from what I understand. And he's also very good and well known within the community. However, I think Thompson's been around a little bit longer and knows the city and knows the community well.
There's really no choice but de Blasio, although I'd really like him to answer to his opinion with regard to his potential, or hopefully not potentially, his relationship with Israel, specifically their treatment of the Palestinians. I think it's a very important issue here in New York, and one that the candidates have been skirting.
I think the one ad with the sun, with Dante, I think that really worked. I think it hit home with a lot of people, especially being in New York City, and a lot of people have different families. So I think that worked, but it didn't necessarily affect my voting for him.
I don't think that's what's primarily in people's minds, but I think that it just serves to show that he's more of a contemporary man, that his family is just as diverse as some of ours are.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's not particularly relevant. You know, I really look to the issues more, so it's hard to say.
Well, a lot of people are not happy with a lot of things that Mr. Loder did in terms of MTA and the tolls and all that. I've discussed that with co-workers who drive. They're not happy.
I think it could eventually hurt him. He does have a history, and obviously, which is a good thing, so you could see his records and his stances and pretty much what he's all about.
Maybe that could be it. It could also be that he was against those kittens. So I don't know. Colbert really got him on the kittens.